Thank George for very provocative and inspiring questions. I'm trying to respond partially, and I put this quotation from Spinoza: "Not to love, not to lament, not to detest, but to understand," because in our discussions on the new nationalism at this conference, we often fall in kind of normative conversation about what universities must do, what universities should do, what is right, what is wrong. I'm trying to look at our situation from some remote perspective, to look at it objectively. And George's questions, in fact, helped me significantly. Let me tell a few words about the context, just to remind you that we have unique legacy. And in fact, George already mentioned that, for example, we don't have this issue of students' movement at all. It's partially because we have very specific legacy, and we have a higher education system that was designed for different purposes, survived perestroika, and Russian higher education system, or Soviet higher education system, was designed as a factory, as a part of the unified factory that Lenin envisaged as a socialist economy. Here we have his famous quotation that socialist society is one factory. And higher education was considered as a manpower production division of this big state corporation. We now study the Soviet education, and we call it quasi-corporate higher education system. And it explains why it was very highly specialized, why universities were located near the production facilities, and graduates were placed to the particular jobs by Central Planning Commission. Another important feature of the Soviet education project was that it was also a factory for producing new people. And again, Lenin mentioned in 1918 that the main function of the education system is to teach communism. The task of young people is to study communism. And this is why ideological courses were compulsory part of the curriculum for everyone. Any attempts to question the basic provisions of Marxist-Leninism were suppressed, and almost 100% of students were members of Young Communist Union. And interestingly enough, it's important for the further discussion that Soviet system really suppressed any nationalism in 15 Soviet republics, including Russia. So it was Soviet nationalist system, I would call it. And without detailed discussion, I can tell that our analysis show that structurally the public higher education system in Russia changed very little since 1939. It's very simple. You look at the number of universities in 1939, and you see that in 2011, the number of universities were almost the same. So the structure of highly specialized universities, their distribution, etc., remained almost the same. It doesn't mean, so that's just a nice picture of young builders, young creators of communism, the mandatory posters that we had in our universities later on without Stalin. In a few weeks, Palgrave will publish our book, 25 Years of Transformation of Higher Education Systems in Post-Soviet Countries. It's a unique study of all 15 countries. What we found as a result, that in all 15 countries, in fact, in Russia less than in other countries, we had an attempt to build national higher education systems. And if we talk about political nationalism, we have to look at these 14 countries where the creation of higher education systems was considered as a means to build new nation state. In the Russia, in fact, situation was a bit different, because after perestroika, the law on education of 1992 and the constitution and Russian constitution of 1993 deliberately prohibited the ideological component in higher education. In fact, still, any political activities at universities is unconstitutional. So you cannot create a unit of ruling party in the Russian university. It's illegal. Also, the mandatory distribution of university graduates was abolished. There was, again, abolition of ideological training. Universities got greater autonomy in curriculum. So this is the first period that George mentioned, early 90s. And at the same time, there were significant structural changes. The growth of educational programs in business, humanities, and law based on new ideology. I would call it strange mix of Marxism and capitalist theories. So the departments of scientific atheism were converted in the Department of Religious Studies. But probably the most important thing about the transformation of higher education in Russia was a dramatic expansion, dramatic growth of enrollment, not just because of the expansion of publicly funded places. It's also it also took a place, but the establishment of private higher education institutions and fee-based places in public universities. So here you can see the expansion of the number of higher education institutions, and here you can see the growth of enrollment since 1992. So today, Russia is among the countries with the highest higher education enrollment in the world. We call it high participation systems, high participation in higher education. So what all this, and by the way, allow me to say a few words about Higher School of Economics, because it's very unique case of newly created university. In fact, after perestroika, not more than 20 universities were newly created, and among them the Higher School of Economics, that developed itself in 25 years from small economics school built in cooperation with London School of Economics into the largest, richest, one of the largest and richest and the most popular Russian universities. And today, High School of Economics is a think tank for the government. And it's interesting, I will refer to that later on. It's considered as a source of objective knowledge and global benchmarking. And since our creation, we were in big discussion, sometimes very nasty arguments with conservatives groups in the country. So what was the evolution of the state higher education policy? And I would agree with George that there were two stages in the higher education policy. The first stage, we call it policy of no policy. The state almost didn't have active policy toward universities till 2004, except Bologna process and introduction of the national university entrance exam. Since 2005, we could indicate three major areas of active higher education policies. And the key area is creating globally competitive research and entrepreneurial universities. The second area was fighting low quality programs that included some constraints on autonomy. But I can give you an example of autonomy of the Russian universities before 2004. University rectors in public universities were elected by the senates. And we had quite a number of instances that the next university rector, we had a son or daughter of the previous rector, because it was kind of hidden privatization of the universities by the small group of academic oligarchs, as we call it. So I personally see quite important reasons for some limits of the university autonomies. And the third area of government policies was mergers of universities to increase quality and efficiency. It also, till 2005, from 2005, we observed significant growth of funding of higher education. And I have to admit that there were no attempts to introduce ideological education or any form of open ideological controls over universities. How can we explain it? And in fact, I skip this slide and come back to it in a few minutes, and this is my last slide. I guess that we have to make a distinction between economic and political nationalism when we discuss the new nationalism and the Russian universities. Economic nationalism, and Igor and some other colleagues yesterday mentioned that, implies that has as priority international competitiveness. And universities are considered as drivers of this competitiveness. So here we have this emphasis on research, innovations, linkages with labor market. And these policies of increasing competitiveness really leads to some paradoxical consequences. So I have here three main initiatives of the Russian government: Russian Excellence Initiative that George mentioned, creation of, together with MIT, School of Science and Technology, Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology, and global education program which aims to send hundreds of Russian students abroad every year. And first I have to respond to George's question that Russian Excellence Initiative, even it's quite young, it does have positive impact. And it does have real results in terms of research productivity, etc. But it has very strong impact on internationalization of the Russian universities. And here you see that 400% growth of number of academics participated in short-term academic mobility in 2016 compared to 2012. More than 100 managers with international experience appeared in the Russian universities almost from zero in 2013. So it's interesting that this economic nationalism leads to greater internationalization and creation of the global public good. What about the political nationalism? Even I said that it was not translated into direct government influence to the actions toward universities, with few exceptions. But to respond to the last George's question, I have to admit that indeed the Russian political nationalism strongly linked with the populism, and it responds. We as social scientists have to admit that it responds to some sentiments, conservative and anti-intellectual sentiments that widely that exist in the Russian society. And we, as university people, cannot ignore these sentiments. We cannot ignore this influence. And I guess it would be very interesting to discuss how can we respond to that. Thanks.